In this video, we're going to be looking at task-specific rubrics and scoring schemes. And so what we need to look at here are how these types of rubrics are different from what we've been talking about so far in the course. The steps that we just went through, mainly in the last two sections, were specifically for writing a general rubric. And we need to talk about other kinds of rubrics. And so because of all the advantages of general rubrics that we've discussed so far, we would almost always want to use one of those because of all the feedback that gets presented to students, because of the way it helps us to be able to break the presentation down or the demonstration of learning down and make it easy to grade and so on, things to focus on in our grading and those kinds of things. And so really the general rubric, and that's why it's called the general rubric, is what most people think of as a rubric. But there are other kinds based on the types of assignments that we are giving to our students. And so that's what we want to look at here. Maybe when would something else be more advantageous than a general rubric, depending on what's going on in our class. So task-specific rubrics, on the other hand, are useful for grading student work that is not necessarily about, creativity and demonstrating lots of knowledge and different ways of presenting that to you and all those kinds of things. It's more of just when you're asking your students to access recall, so memorization of things, and then comprehension of the details of those things. And so that specific knowledge is really what we're trying to measure. And so that would be remembering and understanding facts and concepts, as opposed to matching a description of performance quality. That's the difference in the assignment type that would lend us more to want to use a task-specific rubric. And they are, honestly, much easier for grading because it just doesn't require as much evaluation process. You're really looking for, basically whether they got things right or wrong, or if they recalled a certain number of things, facts about a particular topic that the assignment is on. And so for the most part, task-specific rubrics are much easier for grading. However, they are not intended necessarily for learning to take place. They're not necessarily intended for lots of feedback to go, or really any feedback to go back to the student. It's typically for students that are just receiving a final grade for this project or assignment with no opportunity really for revision or redoing it or resubmitting. This is just kind of a final grade and just kind of a quick rubric for scoring the differences between those. Again, the purpose of the rubric is to set our expectations out to our students of what we're still looking for in a submission, in an excellent submission for the particular question or assignment that we have. But not necessarily to allow feedback and so on. And so, so those are some of the reasons why you would choose a task-specific rubric. This is an example from our book. This is the first example we're going to look at here. This is an example from chapter 5 in our book. And if you went through and read that and looked at this example specifically, it is a math question. It's basically a problem-solving question. And really the way the question is worded is, it's pretty much either right or wrong. And so there's not a lot of depth to, we're not asking our students to create a video on how you solved this problem or, a presentation on how did you do this or anything like that. We're just asking them to answer the question. And so, maybe you're even thinking, well, what do I need a rubric for that for then? Either they got it right or wrong. And so let's look at the rubric that kind of was created specifically with this assignment in mind and see what the difference might be. And so here's the rubric that our author created for this. And so the categories are satisfactory, partial, minimal, and incorrect. Those are the performance levels. Really, there's only one row in this. It's just, again, whether you got it right or wrong, but these are the performance levels, the columns across the rubric. And you can see, there are little differences in the way that the student could have solved this problem that determine how well they understood the problem and how to solve it. And so that's how this rubric is kind of broken up. is in the different scenarios of how the student could have solved the problem. What their mental process was, or what their paperwork process was in looking at their work, and so on. And so I think this is a great example of having a rubric to score a math problem because of the type of problem that it was. So that was one example in our book. Our next example we want to look at is a science essay example. And so the question was, lightning and thunder happen at the same time, but you see the lightning before you hear the thunder. Explain why this is so. Now again, we're really just looking at their explanation and seeing how much detail they got correct in that explanation. It's not, again, they're creating a video presentation or a Prezi on this, or whatever. And so it's really just looking at their essay answer and determining how complete of an answer that was. And so here's the rubric right along with it. And so complete says a student responds that although the thunder and lightning occur at the same time, light travels faster than sound. So the light gets here to your eye before the sound reaches your ear. Partial, student response addresses speed and uses terminology such as thunder for sound and lightning for light, or makes a general statement about speed but does not tell which is faster. So that's the whole key to the answer to this question, is that light travels faster than sound. So we need that in a complete response. An unsatisfactory or incorrect student response doesn't even relate the speeds at which light and sound travel at all. It doesn't use any vocabulary towards that or anything of that nature. And so, again, this is maybe not a real deep rubric, but it does at least give kind of a partial credit type score to this essay question in this test. So what's different about writing a task-specific rubric? As we look at these two examples that we just did from our textbook, we need to see that the grading process is much more holistic in nature as we approach scoring this assignment. We're looking at the entire answer, whether it's an essay form or a numeric answer or showing work or whatever it is. We're looking at that holistically as the entire answer that they've provided. In that math problem and in the science essay, the scoring was done based on the submission as a whole. The criteria within the rubric was, for good work, considered all together what the student was being able to receive feedback on, and individual criterion in order to learn and improve upon future submissions. And so they can still get feedback as to whether they answered the question or not, or the degrees within this rubric. It just doesn't go into extreme detail in every piece of the process that they used. And so there is some feedback still available here. It's just not quite as detailed as a general rubric. So a task-specific rubric is considered a holistic rubric, and a general rubric is considered what we call an analytic rubric, just because of the detail and the breakdown of the pieces of the student's submission. Writing a task-specific rubric, and so here are the steps for writing a task-specific rubric, and I've outlined these for you in a document right underneath this video in Moodle. Write directly for a specific task, not as descriptors for the performance of learning. So you are writing exactly what you want to see from the task that you're asking your students to do. You can use teacher language, since for the most part, depends on what you're doing with this, but for the most part, students will not be seeing the task-specific rubric afterwards, as opposed to general rubrics that are used as a teaching and learning tool. Again, that depends a little bit on how you're using this task-specific rubric. Be sure to leave room in the rubric for multiple good answers, and that's kind of the whole key to the math example specifically, is that there were multiple scenarios that could have gone on within the student answers. And really it counts for different ways that the student could have solved that problem still correctly, but just went about it in a little different way. Writing the task-specific rubric at the same time that you write their test question or assignment is extremely helpful. Just because your brain is engaged on exactly what you're looking for your students to do, and while you're writing kind of those expectations out, or thinking through those expectations, if you can write the rubric kind of at the same time, it's just a helpful process. And then you should solve the problem yourself by writing out an answer that's full and complete and would score full points. And then describe that solution the best you can without including parts of the answer. So you're going to write a solution to the problem, and then you're going to describe what's included in that solution so that you can look for those things in each student's response, because their response, of course, is going to be different than your, especially if it's an essay type thing or a work shown thing. And so you just want to kind of list out the specific things that you're looking for, the pieces that you're looking for in their submissions, and use those as your measuring devices within your rubric. Then you want to determine and describe what successive answers would look like to receive less points for various reasons. And so maybe they left out just one of those pieces that you listed. Again, we're trying to shoot for as much as you can, all the possible scenarios that different students could come up with in their submissions, or what might be missing within them. And do remember that within your task-specific rubric, you can look for counts of things, whereas we don't really want to do that in our general rubrics. And so those are kind of the steps that you want to go through as you write a task-specific rubric. If we are grading multi-piece assignments with point-based scoring themes here, and so in other words, if this was kind of really a multi-piece rubric, and we're wanting to write that out, then again, here's another example from our book. And so maybe you have a question that asks your students to list and explain the steps to a scientific process, or all the steps that they did within their lab experiment, or building something, or solving a specific problem, all the steps they did, and explain those steps. And you want to score your answers, their answers, based on the number of steps included, as well as the number of explanations included. This would be an example of a multi-piece assignment. And so we want to be able to have a point-based scoring theme to that kind of built into our task-specific rubric. So one of our examples, again from our book, is the social studies question that has to do with basically listing out the branches of our government, of our federal government, and what their purpose is. And so, it could be a fairly basic answer here. You're really just going to list a couple words in each part of this table in order to get a correct answer. And then the point-based rubric is down below, to where since there's 6 boxes, it's worth 6 points and you get 1 point for each. But maybe you want to, scale that down a little different way, or, maybe this is like the final question after a bunch of multiple choice questions, and so you want this one to be worth 12 points, or whatever the scenario with your points here, and then being able to break that up within what the question is asking. And then again, the solution is written out here, even though it's a fairly basic solution, but that's what you're looking for in the answers to this specific test question. And so as we're writing point-based scoring themes, we want to identify the major steps that they're going to take to show their solution, the facts that they're going to be including in that solution, the concepts that are included in what you're trying to assess. And so that, again, that could be from your objectives for this particular topic that you are covering within your class, and list those out. In looking at your list, determine whether they all contribute to the answer in the same proportion or not, with the same weight. And so maybe there are just some minor facts that you're looking for, some minor steps to set up the problem in the first place, but then the major steps are, a couple in the middle, or something along that line. Or if some steps and elements are much more important than the others. And so you're going to develop that point value based on how important each piece is in the overall solution, and build your scoring scheme based on that. You would allocate the points then for each item based on what you determine in those first 2 steps, and build your scale from there. If you're building this for one question on an exam, then be sure to balance those total points for this question with the rest of the exam questions. And so like the example I was just talking about, maybe this is kind of like the major question at the end, the judicial branch and executive branch and so on, that question we just looked at. Maybe that's the final question after whatever, 20 multiple choice questions or true false questions or whatever. And so that question then needs to be balanced with all the rest of the point values of the other questions within the exam. So to summarize again, and to look at it just a couple more specific examples here. Let's say you've just taught a unit on the causes of the Civil War. Let's look at another example here. If you remember, this example was in your book. An essay question might ask students to identify and briefly explain causes of the Civil War, which would require recall and comprehension. They have to remember those things from maybe a list or the lecture that you've done, the things that you've presented, the videos you've shown, whatever it might be. A task-specific rubric for grading based on a point system might include students earning 1 point each for identifying up to 4 possible causes and 1 point each for correct explanation for each of those causes. That makes a total of 8 points for the question. And so you're breaking down the question into point values based on what they've included in their response. And so literally, you could score this in an extremely basic rubric to where as you're reading their response, you're basically doing just a tally mark scoring process here. And so if they have, they only came up with 3 causes and 3 explanations, then of course their total is only 6 points. And so this is a very basic example of looking at a scoring process for a task-specific rubric. So to summarize that, notice that this type of rubric differs from a general rubric, where counting things is discouraged in the general rubrics, except in special cases. Here, in task-specific rubrics, we're kind of doing that, or that's built into a lot of them anyway. Counting items works here because enumerating facts and concepts is exactly what you're trying to assess with the type of assignment that you're matching this task-specific rubric to. Task-specific rubrics do serve a purpose, and mainly that purpose is getting not just a grade, but a grade based on the very specific things that you are looking for within their assignment submissions. And so they definitely serve a purpose, but again, they are much easier to grade with because they don't require quite as much detail in the grading process of what you're reviewing. General rubrics serve a wider purpose and goal. Their goal is for teaching and learning because of that feedback and the consistent use of those. And so these rubrics are just specifically for the grading process of your students showing that knowledge and comprehension in very specific ways.